This is the reckoning.
This is amazing.
The Capitol Dome, a silent sentinel in the night. Red smoke swirls behind the men in silhouette. A subtle eye watches from the haze of Capitol. A ghost in the current, the weight of a gilded past. Inverted totalitarianism.
Imagine that the freedom you cherish so dearly, the one you believe defines not only your life, but the lives of those who came before you, was never quite what you thought it was. Not a lie, not entirely, but not the full truth either. Imagine that you weren't stripped of it in some dramatic collapse, no singular moment where everything changed overnight. Instead, it was shaped gradually, quietly, so subtly that by the time you began to question it, it already felt natural. You wake up each day within a system that feels familiar. You move through institutions that seem stable, participating in rituals that give you the impression of control, choosing leaders, forming opinions, expressing beliefs. And because these actions are visible, because they are repeated, because they are shared by millions around you, they feel real. They feel like proof that the system works. But what if the true measure of a system is not what it allows you to see, but what it never requires you to question? What if control in its most refined form doesn't look like force at all? What if it need not silence you because it has already shaped the boundaries of what you are able to imagine? Not by restricting your voice, but by guiding it. Not by removing your freedom, but by defining it so carefully that it never threatens the structure it exists within. And if such a system were possible, would you recognize it? What would you sacrifice for it? Because there is a difference between a system that demands obedience and one that produces it naturally. The former relies on visible authority. The latter relies on something far more effective: participation. Voluntary, continuous, unquestioned participation. And participation, when left unexamined, becomes indistinguishable from consent. This is where the story becomes less about what is done to people and more about what people come to accept, neither because they are weak nor because they are incapable, but because the environment they exist within has been structured in such a way that alternatives become harder to see, harder to imagine, and eventually harder to believe in at all. Consider how power has traditionally been understood. Kings, dictators, regimes, figures, and systems that rule visibly, often forcefully. We forget, but history remembers them clearly because their control was blatant. It had to be. It depended on being seen. But what happens when power evolves? What happens when it no longer needs to manifest itself so overtly? What happens when it disperses across institutions, across systems, across networks of influence, so that no single point here is responsible, and yet the outcome remains remarkably consistent? As we embark on this journey of questioning, we inevitably encounter the work of Sheldon S. Wolin. Wolin was not concerned with imaginary forces or hidden rulers. He was concerned with something much more concrete and much more difficult to dismiss: the observable transformation of modern democracy. Not its rapture, but its gradual evolution into a form that looks familiar only outwardly, while functioning entirely differently underneath. He described this transformation with a term that feels almost paradoxical: inverted totalitarianism. Unlike the totalitarian systems of the past, where power was centralized, authoritarian, and openly repressive, this inverted form does not announce itself. It does not abolish democratic institutions, it preserves them. Such does not eliminate participation, but alters its nature. Participation becomes more reactive and less proactive. Citizens respond to choices that have already been structured rather than creating new ones. Engagement becomes more about selecting between options rather than defining what those options should be in the first place. And with time, something subtle begins to occur. People remain active but less effective, informed but not empowered, present but increasingly peripheral. Wolin also points to something even more nuanced, something that makes the system particularly resilient. It does not rely solely on control from above. It is reinforced from within society itself, through culture, through media, through the constant flow of information that shapes perception, attention, and priority. In a world saturated with information, attention becomes fragmented, depth gives way to immediacy, and reflection is replaced by reaction. In that kind of environment, sustained collective awareness, the kind necessary for a deeply functioning democracy, becomes more difficult to maintain. Not impossible, but increasingly rare. And when awareness diminishes, oversight weakens, not because people don't care, but because the conditions required for meaningful engagement are harder to sustain. The result is not a population that is oppressed in the traditional sense. It is a population that is absorbed. Absorbed in cycles of consumption, distraction, and surface level engagement, active enough to feel involved, but not positioned to fundamentally alter the very structures they participate in. And perhaps the most striking aspect of all of this is that it does not feel like domination. It feels like life. It feels like routine. It feels like the world as it has always been, which raises a question that is as uncomfortable as it is necessary. If a system can maintain the appearance of freedom while quietly redefining its limits, at what point does perception become more influential than reality? This is the tension at the heart of Wolin's work. Not a claim that democracy has disappeared, but a warning that it can be transformed into something that resembles itself without functioning as it once did. That transformation does not require secrecy, it requires one thing: time. For structures to solidify, time for behaviors to normalize, time for generations to inherit a system without ever having seen its earlier form. This is not a call to reject everything you know. It is not an attempt to replace one certainty with another. It is an invitation, nothing more, nothing less, to observe more carefully, to question more precisely, to look beyond appearances and consider the underlying patterns that shape them. Because once you begin to see those patterns, you may find that the question is no longer whether you are free, but how that freedom is defined, where it begins, where it ends, and who or what has the power to shape it. This is not the end of the conversation, it is the beginning of it. Because understanding the system you live within is not an act of rebellion, it is an act of awareness. And awareness is the mother of change.
The owners of this country know the truth. It's called the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it.